It's great to see so many of you out here. Although congratulations, by attending today, you've now earned yourself an IRS audit. You know, it just seems one scandal after another with this administration. Like, when is it going to stop? And this next panel will detail the scandals in depth. You know, it's funny, I forgot my computer password the other day, and I wanted to call the NSA because I'm pretty sure they have it. But no, the next panel is a wonderful array of think tank people and institutes, and to lead that panel is Dr. Donald Devine, who is a rock star in the conservative movement, who helped start ACU and is very, very insightful in all things conservative public policy. So without any further ado, Dr. Donald Devine.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's pretty much the way we went over it. My name is Donald Devine. I'm a Vice Chairman of the American Conservative Union. But really my claim to fame is I was Ronald Reagan's chief bureaucrat, the head of the civil service for his first term. Remember when he called me up, he said, "Don, I got a job for you." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "OPM, the Office of Personnel Management." My son used to call it opium. I said, "Well, that's kind of a funny job to give a libertarian conservative like me." And he said, "Well, I got a sense of humor." I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "Well, I want you to cut back 100,000 non-defense employees. I want you to reduce their bloated benefits. And I want you to make them work harder." I said, "Thanks a lot, going to make a lot of friends in this job." I always remember what Harry Truman said: if you do a tough job in Washington and you need a friend, buy a dog. So I bought two to be on the safe side. But the fact is we did it. We did cut 100,000. I saved $6 billion, which is about $60 billion in today's money, and we made them work harder. We put in a pay-for-performance system for them. Ronald Reagan proved that you can run government correctly, mainly by pushing it back to the states and the people, as the 10th Amendment says. And Ronald Reagan, it's there. It's not me making this up. This is in Obama's budget. Over Ronald Reagan's 8 years, non-defense discretionary spending, that's what runs the government, went down by 9.5%. The only president in modern times that actually cut domestic government. Not bad, huh? Even including entitlements, it went down relatively, went down absolutely in terms of discretionary spending. And what was the result? 25 years of prosperity right up until the recent crisis. That's the good news. The bad news is we've got a new president by the name of Barack Obama. And that's what this panel is about. I know it's probably not your favorite subject, but they're going to talk about this in a very interesting way. The first speaker is Joe Bast. Joe Bast is the president of the Heartland Institute in Illinois. People used to think it was a state think tank. It's really a national think tank, but happens to be based out in the real world in the Midwest. So let's first welcome Joe Bast. Joe is a great expert on environmentalism, going to talk about global warming. Our second speaker is Tom Fitton, who's the president of Judicial Watch, and this is the group that does real investigation into scandals and reveals a lot of the hidden places. He's the author of the Corruption Chronicles, which is on the New York Times bestseller list. Tom? Our next speaker is John Solomon, who's the editor of the Washington Times, investigative journalist par excellence. He was the first one to investigate Fast and Furious, and he'll tell you a little more about that. This is when they went crazy on the guns, and he wrote the original story on Benghazi. Let's welcome John, please. Next speaker will be Bill Randles. He's an attorney. He ran for governor of Missouri. He went to Harvard Law. We'll forgive him for that, but believe it, he had to go at the same time as Barack Obama. He is fighting the Tea Party case against the Internal Revenue Service. Bill? And last but not least, Myron Ebell, who is the Director of Energy Environmental Policy for the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's third on the list of the 10 most respected warming skeptics, and he's one of 6, Rolling Stone called him one of the 6 great misleaders on global warming. And he will finish up in some. Please welcome Myron, too. And Joe, why don't you start off?
All right, thanks, Don. All right, how are you all feeling? You're looking good. Don is too modest to mention that he has a new book out titled America's Way Back, Reclaiming Freedom, Tradition, and Constitution. This is an outstanding book. Yep. Congratulations, Don. It's just excellent. He's going to be speaking in Chicago maybe in a couple of weeks, I think, at a Heartland event talking about his new book. And speaking of Chicago, how many of you attended the CPAC Chicago event? Any of you? Only a few? Joe Morris and Kathy Morris, thank you. It was an outstanding event. It really energized folks in Illinois, and I hope that this event has the same kind of impact here in Missouri. The Heartland Institute addresses state issues nationwide. We cover everything from school reform to healthcare to environment to entitlement reform. So we're in an ideal position to watch the parade of Obama scandals marching down the road. I'm going to focus on just one, and that's global warming, or the so-called climate change, because this is a great example of omnipotence at home and impotence abroad, which is the title of this panel. Concerning omnipotence at home, regulating energy is a path for omnipotent government. Energy is what Julian Simon once called the master resource. Everything we do, everything we eat, our clothes, our shelter, the way that we transport ourselves, all of it involves energy. If you can control energy, you can control every aspect of a person's life. The ability of the Obama administration to make a case for regulating energy comes out of its positions on global warming. By claiming that human activity has an impact on climate and that that's a negative impact, he's making the case for increased regulation over coal-powered electric plants, over everything from regulating the energy efficiency of appliances to controlling the density of housing and transportation policies. The Obama administration used junk science to justify its position on climate change. One of the messages I hope you'll get out of this panel, and I'm sure Myron Ebell is going to elaborate on this as well, is that the science of climate change is anything but settled. There's definitely no consensus on this issue. The Heartland Institute just last week helped a group called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change release a 1,000-page report on climate that concludes that the human impact is very small and that the change in temperature that could result from a human impact is so small that it just disappears behind background variability. That's probably no surprise to anybody in this room, but it runs exactly counter to what the IPCC is telling us, the United Nations agency in charge of this. There's plenty of research that suggests that global warming is not a crisis, that the Obama administration, Democrats, and environmental groups have been working to whip up public fear and hysteria over an environmental issue in order to increase its power over domestic manufacturing and every aspect of our lives. The Obama administration just this past week has adopted regulations on new coal plants that essentially bans them, makes it almost virtually impossible for a new coal plant to be built in the United States. They've made it clear that they want to apply new regulations to existing coal plants. That's going to force them into bankruptcy. They've still been opposing the Keystone Pipeline, despite all the jobs that would create, despite the importance that has to the energy infrastructure of the United States. And they're actively implementing what many of you will recognize as Agenda 21 ideas. These are ideas started by the United Nations, now going on 3 decades ago, that extend all the way down to the community level in the United States on all sorts of land use regulations, agriculture, just about every aspect of your life can be affected by that. All of this is being done in the name of a false science, an unproven theory, and something that we all need to be battling against. So while global warming is used as a justification for omnipotence at home, it also is a great example of our impotence internationally. So the United States is essentially delegating control over the science of this important issue to an agency of the United Nations, the IPCC. So when the EPA argued that global warming endangers human health, or carbon dioxide endangers human health, it cited the IPCC's reports. So in effect, the United States outsourced the science on the most important science controversy of our day to the United Nations. We're now signing treaties or attempting to sign treaties that further diminish United States sovereignty in the name of global warming. So we had Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and now Secretary of State John Kerry trying to negotiate and get approval for treaties that are essentially all pain and no gain for the United States. These treaties have us reducing our emissions, us paying other countries sort of reparations for our past emissions of carbon dioxide, and we export our jobs to countries like India and China that aren't parties to the treaty, that haven't agreed to cap their own emissions. And the other countries just continue to increase their emissions. They get massive subsidies from us, which go to their crony capitalist friends and corrupt regimes, and they get the benefit of all the manufacturing jobs that should otherwise have been here in the United States. So at the international level, I think global warming is a great example of our impotence, where we're signing treaties that are clearly against the best interests of the United States and consumers. We're outsourcing our science and our manufacturing, even our energy sources, to other countries. Ideally, we can resist this, and I'm hopeful. Just this week now, the IPCC issued a report claiming that it's even more confident than ever before that there's a human impact on climate and that it's really terrible. This is ridiculous on its face. We've had no warming for the last 17 years. Okay, all their models are wrong. Their own research now is admitting over and over again that they've left things out and that they can't explain the actual causes of climate change. I'm hopeful that everybody in this room takes that message back to your family and friends, to your children, to school teachers in your area, and to your elected officials, and make sure that they know that global warming is not settled science, that it's not a crisis that justifies the kind of policies that the Obama administration is trying to implement, and it certainly doesn't justify losing American sovereignty to other countries in the name of somehow preventing a global threat. So that's my crisis that the Obama administration is creating for us. And Jeff, you're next? Tom is next.
I'm outraged. Are you outraged? Yeah. You may say, what are you outraged about? Well, I'm outraged about everything, especially during the Obama age. Those of you who don't know, as Don suggested, we're an anti-corruption watchdog group, Judicial Watch is, and we go after government corruption. And as you might imagine, we've been quite busy with the Obama administration. This administration is off the rails and out of control. And I'm not just talking policy. I'm not talking policy. I'm talking ethics. I'm talking about obeying the law. I'm talking about treating the federal government like a Chicago ward operation. How about this fun fact? Obama was interviewed a month before he was inaugurated by the FBI about the illegal attempt by his Illinois buddies to sell Obama's vacated Senate seat. Boy, that Obama is quite the history maker. Normally, presidents have to wait before they're sworn into office before being interviewed by the FBI about a government scandal. Let's talk about another issue the FBI ought to be talking to Obama about, his IRS scandal. You know, in my experience, BOLO is a law enforcement term for be on the lookout for criminals and suspects on the run. For the Obama IRS, BOLO is meant literally be on the lookout for Tea Party groups seeking tax-exempt status who want to focus on making America a better place, or, quote, who wanted to talk about the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The IRS suppression of Obama's political opposition was epic. Over the course of more than 27 months, just before the elections, of course, not a single Tea Party-type organization received tax-exempt status. Reports are that nearly 500 groups were targeted. The IRS scandal was a systematic and concerted effort to squash the Tea Party movement during the election season, and it was successful. If you want to know how an election is stolen in plain sight, this is how. We need accountability on the IRS scandal, but we also need massive reform. The IRS's wings need to be clipped. This corrupt and politicized bureaucracy ought to have no authority over Americans who want to gather together to exercise their First Amendment and God-given rights to participate in the public policy process. And then there's Benghazi. You know, one is reminded of what was said about Bill Clinton, that he lied and lied and lied until, quote, there was no one left to lie to. Barack Obama and his minions have lied and lied and lied to the entire world, and obviously to America, about the Benghazi massacre. And yet here we are, over a year after the attack, and there has been zero accountability. No military action, no drones, no arrests, no one has been fired, and Congress continues a slow-motion investigation that feeds that Obama is happy to stonewall. The president's policies, by the way, aren't just wrong, but his way of operation, his way of governance, has unhinged our Republican form of government. The law isn't what Barack Obama says it is what our Constitution says it is. This president has gotten into the nasty habit of using "we can't wait" as an excuse to unilaterally rewrite, refuse to enforce, and delay laws. Our message back to him should be, yes, Mr. President, you will wait. Judicial Watch has uncovered nearly 40 separate examples of executive overreach. I can't list them all here. And it doesn't even include Obama's several dozen czars. Obama, the one-man Congress, is even rewriting his own Obamacare law, delaying the employer mandate an entire year on his own, and giving Congress a get-out-of-Obamacare free card by allowing Congress to get special taxpayer-funded insurance subsidies that the Obamacare law expressly prohibits. So you can see why Congress is often happy to be supine in the face of Obama's power grabs. And of course, you have his appointees as well. Eric Holder. Why in Lord's name is he still Attorney General? The Fast and Furious scandal, we've had a lot of talk and a lot of concern, rightly so, about these mass murders that have taken place in America in the last few years. Fast and Furious is a slow-motion mass murder with guns provided by our U.S. government. by the agency run by Eric Holder, who lied and stonewalled about that terrible, terrible scandal that resulted in the death of Brian Terry and hundreds of Mexicans. The fact that he remains Attorney General tells you a lot about the dysfunction of Washington in terms of the rule of law and its inability to hold corrupt government officials to account. What should we do? Now, Judicial Watch, of course, provides independent oversight and legal challenges. We've sued 120 times just to get documents from the most transparent administration in history. But we need more investigations, more criminal prosecutions, more oversight by Congress, and more oversight of Congress. And let me suggest that we all agree on one issue as we go forward. We have a president and not a king. Thank you very much.
I'm the editor of the Washington Times, and thank you. That's good to hear. That's what we like to say in Washington. We like to call ourselves that other newspaper that isn't afraid to report on the scandals and the mistruths and the mistakes that go on in Washington. So thank you for your support. One of the things about batting cleanup in a lineup like this is that three wiser men have already spoken before me, so I'll keep my remarks short and so we can get to your questions. But I want to talk about a couple things as a journalist covering scandals and as running a newspaper that's in the midst of a very gridlocked Washington. Two things come to mind. I think earlier this year I was at CPAC in Washington when I fielded a question what I thought about what would happen to the Arab Spring. And I said I feared that the Arab Spring would become the American autumn on the global stage. And I think over this summer we've begun to see the consequences of incompetence or uncertainty on the global stage that this administration has displayed on a daily basis. This president has managed, I think all sides agree, to take red lines and turn them into pink lines and to take the opportunity to exercise soft or hard power on the global stage and yield it instead to Russia's great pipe dream of becoming a superpower like America. And so we're seeing a period in Washington where our power, our ability to lead in the world and even internally has been greatly diminished. And I've been surprised, even as a journalist in Washington for 25 years, to see how many things have rapidly declined. Add to that the gridlock, and you begin to understand the frustration that you all experience here in the heartland of America, where you have good values and you work hard and you wonder what we're all doing in Washington. So we share your frustration at the times in the city that we have to cover for you. I think the second thing that strikes me, I'm an editor by title, but I'm an investigative reporter by heart. And for the last 25 years, I've covered most of the scandals in Washington, and most of them usually evolve around three things: sex, money, and power. Now, in the Clinton years, they were a little bit more towards the sex side, but otherwise, they usually revolve around those three things. But this presidency has offered sort of a different type of scandal, a scandal that I would call the scandal of incompetency. We have seen just the inability to command the stage, to command Washington, to command global leadership. And a lot of the things that I've covered and been involved in go back to that in ways that I haven't probably seen since the years of Jimmy Carter. Take, for instance, the idea that a group of administration officials actually got together one day inside the Justice Department and thought it would be a really good idea to send semi-automatic weapons from America to Mexico so that they could be used in murder so that we then could make a criminal case against some of the drug lords. The competency behind that, I think you all understand, and I know common sense Americans wouldn't have ever accepted that, but we've had to accept that in Washington, and we've had a lot of excuses made for why we're doing things like that. You take a look at the Energy Department, and somewhere early on in the administration, a group of administration officials stood around and thought it would be a really good idea to take $500 million of your hard-earned tax dollars and give them to a company that already had numerous red flags that it was about to fail. And that gave us the great Solyndra scandal that you all remember. We at the Washington Times have a weekly award. It's called the Golden Hammer, and it's named after the famous $600 hammer that the Pentagon once gave us. And we've only had it for about 15 months. We've been able to identify more than $66 billion that have been misspent or abused in the last 3 years. And I think that speaks to the volume of incompetency that Washington has given us. So as we get to your questions today, I hope we can delve into a little bit more of this and take some of your concerns and bring them back home to the folks that should be governing better than they are. So thank you for your time, and I'll, as they say in Washington, yield my time to a much wiser speaker.
Hello. Do we have any fans of the IRS here today?
That's right.
No? Well, that's good, because if you were, you might be a little uncomfortable. Back in May, my wife Bev and I were having lunch with a lawyer friend of ours in Kansas City, and he turned to me and asked a question that any conservative lawyer would like to hear. He said, how would you like to help us put together the first lawsuit against the IRS on behalf of the Tea Party groups? That was pretty much my response. And so we put together the first lawsuit to be filed, and the only lawsuit seeking class certification on behalf of all the groups. And I thought I'd take a minute or two to explain some things to you about that lawsuit, tell you a few things that maybe you've heard and a few things maybe you haven't heard. You know, we've been told that this was all an accident and that it was all even-handed. You know, it happened to all groups the same. Well, let me tell you what really happened. Beginning around April of 2010, somebody in the IRS, and nobody will say who yet, but we'll get to the bottom of it in litigation. But somebody decided that they were going to pick out certain groups for special treatment, they called it. Now, here's how they decided to originally pick out the groups, just based on their name. And the names they picked were Tea Party, Patriots, 9/12, and We the People. Now, that sounds fair and even-handed, doesn't it? Now, later they decided to expand that criteria to include the issues that the group was interested in. Things like government spending, whether you think the government's on the wrong track, whether you want to educate people about the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Now, that's nefarious activity. Or any statement in the file criticizing how the government's being run. Now, that sounds even-handed, doesn't it? Sounds fair and balanced. Well, it won't surprise you to know that only conservative groups were picked out. No liberal group received this treatment. Now, once you were picked out, the treatment got very special. By and large, you were just put on ice. Your request for a tax-exempt status, which is pretty much automatic if you were a liberal group, just didn't happen. At one point, they did no work on these cases for 13 months. For 11 months, they simply titled these cases in their internal files the Tea Party cases. So clearly it was fair and even-handed and represented a broad political spectrum, didn't it? Here's one of the things that would happen to you if you were part of that group. After they sat on your file for months and months, in early 2012, they decided, well, we've got to do something. So they sent a massive request of information to the groups, requesting more than I can get into here today. But after 11 months of doing nothing, they gave you 2 weeks to respond under penalty of perjury to the following things. List every meeting you've ever had, everything discussed at those meetings, everyone who participated in the meetings, every one of your directors, every one of your members, all of your members' application forms to join your group, information about your donors, and here's my personal favorite. For any political candidates that spoke to your group, provide transcripts of their speeches. Now, some of you may know I spent a couple of years running for governor. I spoke to groups from 6 to 600 and gave hundreds of speeches. To my knowledge, there's not one transcript out there. We're not making transcripts here today. But these mom-and-pop operations, just neighbors, are supposed to compile transcripts. Do you all keep a court reporter on hand following you around? No? We have a court reporter here today? Of course not. But you're supposed to compile all this information in 2 weeks, and then you sign a form under penalty of perjury that it's true, accurate, and complete. Now, this is what they call in law a heads I win, tails you lose situation, because you just simply can't do it. So it won't surprise you to know that a lot of conservative groups were scared off, just as our second speaker said. They were scared out of the process. They didn't even participate. And this covered 2 election cycles, 2010. You remember what was happening in 2010, don't you? Early 2010, they put the brakes on. And in January of 2012, just as the president is ramping up his re-election campaign, they clamped down on the Tea Party groups again. Now, this is going to be a tough process. The IRS is fighting back. They've essentially taken the position in this litigation, we did nothing wrong, despite the fact that they've apologized publicly and even the president has criticized it. They've taken the position, even if we did do something wrong, you can't sue us over it. So it's going to be a long battle. To date, they haven't produced one piece of paper, although they claim there are 68 million pages that refer to this issue. So we're going to have a long struggle, but I'm telling you this. Congress has its limits. It has many issues it has to deal with. And the press, even when it's trying to be fair, has a lot of issues to talk about. But in this litigation, we have experienced attorneys who are focusing their full attention on it, and we're going to hold the IRS accountable. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here, and I'd like to thank the American Conservative Union for holding this event. It's always great to be out of Washington, but it's especially wonderful for me to be here with you today. I should say I've known and worked with Don Devine, Joe Bast, and Tom Fitton for a number of years. They are great assets to the conservative movement. I encourage you to read Don Devine's new book, America's Way Back. ACU and Joe Bast's Heartland Institute, also along with the Conservative Enterprise Institute for which I work, belong to the Cooler Heads Coalition that fights the global warming agenda and energy rationing legislation. And Joe's and his group have done the most to fight junk science in the climate change debate. I want to talk today about some examples of cronyism, corruption, and lawlessness in the Obama administration. I'm going to start a little bit before then. In 1780, Massachusetts adopted its Constitution. It's the oldest Constitution functioning in the world. It was drafted by John Adams. It does not begin with articles enumerating the authority of government. It begins with a Bill of Rights. And in that Bill of Rights, John Adams makes very clear that to keep our freedom, to keep our rights, we must have limits and controls on government. We must have a strict division of powers, as Adams wrote, in order to make this a government of laws and not of men. Unfortunately, we have come a long way towards a government of men and not of laws, beginning probably with the progressive movement in the late 19th century. President Obama is taking advantage of that decay and hollowing out of our institutions of limited government. And I want to give you some examples. Joe talked about EPA, and I'm going to talk about EPA, but I first want to talk about, go back, Solyndra was mentioned at the Department of Energy. $535 million was loaned to a company, the major shareholder of whom was George Kaiser and his family foundation. George Kaiser, guess who he is? He's a major Democratic donor and Obama bundler. When Solyndra collapsed and the federal taxpayers lost $535 million, it came out that George Kaiser had visited the White House 16 times. But the White House assured us that they never discussed Solyndra. They were only talking about George Kaiser's charitable work. This is the kind of cronyism that is being funded by our tax dollars so that President Obama can reward his friends. And of course, he is also working to punish his enemies. We have an environmental protection agency that has become the second most important economic agency in government after the U.S. Treasury. When President Obama came into office, he said he was going to pass cap-and-trade legislation. That's a sneaky tax, an indirect tax on energy use. The Democratic Congress in 2009 and 10 failed to pass that legislation. The day after the election in November of 2010, when the Republicans took over the House, and I would point out they largely took over the House by defeating Democrats who had voted for cap and trade. They did not take over the Senate because the Senate did not vote on cap and trade. The president did not give up. He said, I'm going to go ahead anyway. There are more ways to skin the cat. Well, how can a president go ahead when Congress hasn't passed a law? Well, the way he can do it is to twist every regulation towards his agenda. And his agenda is to raise energy prices. Not in California, they already have high electric rates. Not in New York and New England, they already have high electric rates. No, in the manufacturing heartland that depends upon coal and natural gas for their electricity. Now, let's see, which are the Democratic parts of the country and which are the Republican parts? California, high electric rates, Democratic. New York, high electric rates, Democratic. New England, high electric rates, Democratic. So let's punish the Republican heartland where all of our manufacturing is now concentrated. That is the agenda of a president who has no respect for the law. Let me give you a couple of examples. Have you heard of Richard Windsor? Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, used a fake email account in the name of Richard Windsor, which my colleague Chris Horner at CEI discovered through the Freedom of Information Act requests, which we have had, and Tom Fitton's group, Judicial Watch, have had to go to court over and over and over again to make the Obama administration obey the Freedom of Information Act, which was supposed to be the most open and transparent administration in history. We have something like, 8 or 10 lawsuits right now going. The Richard Windsor lawsuit resulted in 12,000 emails. Virtually every one of them is redacted heavily. That is, they have blacked them out. You can't read what's in them. So we are now back in court to try to force them to unredact some of these emails. But one of the things we discovered was Lisa Jackson was doing official business under the false name Richard Windsor. This should be disturbing. Richard Windsor, in his 4 years at EPA, every year got a certificate emailed to Richard Windsor at EPA.gov, naming Richard Windsor as a scholar of ethical behavior because Richard Windsor had done all of the training for complying with the Freedom of Information Act. Lisa Jackson never got a scholar of ethical behavior. Now, I just want to conclude with a couple of items here. This is not just EPA, it's not just the Department of Energy. At Interior, which controls the 30% of our land base that's federal lands, and also administers the Endangered Species Act, which is a threat to property rights and prosperity in very large parts of this country's rural areas. They are expanding the reach of the Endangered Species Act with no legislative authority. They got $88 million in the stimulus bill to create, this sounds very harmless and boring, 23 landscape conservation cooperatives. I encourage you to look up landscape conservation cooperatives and see what they have in store for the rural parts of your state. This is an expansion of the Endangered Species Act in the name of climate change, planning for climate change. So they have combined the global warming agenda with the land use control agenda. And finally, I would just mention, we talked about, Joe talked about international impotence on climate change. I just mentioned that when Secretary John Kerry became Secretary of State and was sworn in his first speech at the University of Virginia Law School, he said that the greatest security threat to our country was climate change, and that was what he was going to concentrate on as Secretary of State. Does that explain a lot about what's going on with our foreign policy? But I think we have reached a very dire strait. We are becoming a government of men and not of laws, and we need, thank God for all of you, we need to work together to restore a government of laws and not of men. Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting that most of our questions are kind of on the same subject, but I'm going to save that for last. I'll start with some, Bill, should Lois Lerner be given immunity?
Not yet.
That's a soft case.
You know, she's the person who took the Fifth Amendment in front of Congress. Congress was going to deal with it, but you know how these things go in Congress. We have sued her in our case, and she has been served. She is now an official defendant. I'd like to find out if she's willing to just let the claim against her prevail, or if she's going to speak to answer on her own behalf. Because right now, we paid her for several months, taxpayer money. She's now retired and being paid by the taxpayer. This suit puts her at personal financial risk. Let's find out if she's willing to just have a judgment entered against her and speak. Then let's revisit the immunity question.
Tom, do you have any comment on that either?
Well, I don't think Lois Lerner is obviously she's one of the bad people involved in the IRS scandal. The president is responsible for this. The question is whether the president should be given immunity. It's his agency, under his watch. They all thought they were doing what the president and the Democratic left wanted done, and they did as ordered. And they didn't need a phone call from the White House. All they needed to do was look to the skies, and the president wrote it there for them.
Very good.
Well, that kind of gets to the question everybody's interested in. But John, who was in the White House Situation Room during Benghazi?
Good question. We don't know all the people there, minus the photo ops that we've seen, but you know, I think Hillary Clinton, Leon Panetta, and probably Dave Petraeus were the primary drivers of the conversation that night. And I think we do not know the discussion that went into a lot of the decisions that we now call bad and which the administration called misguided. There's never been a time before this where an installation, a diplomatic installation overseas was attacked that we didn't immediately activate boots and put them on the ground. And I think that question has not been fully vetted by the media for sure, and also by by Congress. And I'd like to get to the bottom of that. So I'd love to have been a fly in the wall that night. And I think if Congress does its job better, we should be able to get those answers.
Tom, any quick point?
Well, the problem is Congress isn't doing its job well. They do a half-hearted hearing here and there. The administration's in full Stonewall mode with Freedom of Information Act requests. And there's been a push for a select committee by Congressman Frank Wolf and others. And if this is an important issue, Congress will put the resources into it. And so far, they don't think it's important, and we need to let them know otherwise.
Joe, you mentioned the effect of the new regulations on coal plants. How can somebody in the audience kind of get a better sense of how it would affect their area? I mean, how could they have some practical idea of what this is going to do in their area, this new regulation on restricting coal power plants?
Well, as of probably 3 years ago, there were over 100 new coal plants that were planned in the United States. They've all been canceled. So in your part of the country, it's entirely likely that there was going to be an expansion of coal-powered power plants. That would have lowered your energy costs, would have created jobs, would have possibly attracted business into your area. Those are all gone now. There's no chance that those coal plants are going to be built. If the new regulations, in fact, are passed that apply to existing coal-powered plants, you're going to see higher electric rates as these coal companies have to add new equipment, new procedures to their plants in order to reduce their emissions or sequester their carbon dioxide emissions. So pretty dramatically higher energy costs. Back about 5-6 years ago, we were estimating the cost of reducing emissions in the United States back to 1990 levels, the original requirement under the Kyoto Protocol. And there were estimates that the per household cost of reducing emissions to that level were about $4,300. Over $4,000 a year per household in higher energy costs as a result of trying to shift away from coal-powered electricity plants. So that's the dollar amounts that we're looking at.
Myron, you have anything to add to that?
Well, Joe's a little out of date. You know, the costs of dealing with global warming have gone down significantly. It's called economic decline. As President Klaus of the Czech Republic said, I have lived through the end of communism and the creation of a free society in my country, and the consequence of that was destroying the communist economy and building a new free market capitalist economy. And when they closed all the steel mills in Czechoslovakia, emissions went down dramatically. Well, the same thing is happening in this country as we continue to have economic decline. So there is a very, I would say there's a very, I don't want to say it's causal entirely, but there's a very close correlation between economic activity and energy use. So if we want to reduce our emissions, we just need to keep the economy going the way it is.
What, Byron, back to you again, and Joe can comment on it too. What is the real impact of human activity on the planet? I mean, what is our best intellectual short answer to the question? All right, we know that they're fooling around with the science, but how would you kind of give a nice short answer to what the problem is in the environment to the extent there is one?
Well, thank you. Human beings clearly impact the climate. Human society has been impacting the climate at least since the great civilizations of the ancient world in Persia and the Mediterranean through land use change. The principal culprit today, of course, is burning coal, oil, and natural gas, which provides the world with over 80% of its energy. And it's the cheaper 80%, the less expensive 80%. So to limit that is going to put a governor on economic growth and prosperity, and it will, particularly in poor countries, consign poor people in poor countries to perpetual economic poverty. But what is the role of burning coal, oil, and natural gas? Well, in the last 15, 16 years, the carbon dioxide level has gone up to about 400 parts per million, which is about a 12% increase. And I would point out, this is an aside, but this is not short and concise, but when the Waxman-Markey bill was debated in 2009, a senior Republican member of Congress went up in the elevator in the Rayburn House office building that night after the vote with 3 senior Democrats. And he said, I'm really interested in all this debate about carbon dioxide. How much is there in the atmosphere exactly? Of course, he knew. He's one of the few people in Congress, along with Jim Inhofe in the Senate, who knows anything about the science of climate change. The first Democratic congressman, and these were 3 senior Democrats who had been involved in the debate, said, I think it's 10%. Remember, it's 4/100ths of 1%. The next said, no, that's too low, it's 20%. And the third said, no, I think it's 60%.
Holy.
This is the level that our public policies are being based on, this level of knowledge by the left. Now, the question is, and I will now answer your question, how sensitive is the climate to carbon dioxide levels? Well, the computer models that are used by the UN global warming body all say that this climate is very sensitive to higher carbon dioxide levels. The temperature record, as Joe said absolutely correctly, shows completely the opposite. While carbon dioxide levels have gone up 12% in the last 15, 16 years, the global mean temperature has not gone up at all, which suggests that there is some climate sensitivity, but it's not very much.
Joe, you want to add anything? Quick.
Yeah, we could get into the high weeds on this pretty quickly, but Myron, I think, captured it really well. We know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We know that the concentrations are going up in the atmosphere, and we know that all else held constant, that should cause some warming. What we don't know is how everything else changes when carbon dioxide goes up and when a small amount of warming starts to occur. And most scientists who study it, who aren't paid by the government to come up with a radical conclusion, say that cloud cover changes, heat gets vented out of the tropics. There's all sorts of processes that counteract the warming. And the result is the amount of warming is very small. So, you're looking at 1 degree over a century, an amount that's too small to tell from background variation, certainly too small when we're coming out of a little ice age. So you would expect a little bit of warming anyway, just from natural causes.
John and then Bill, Where is the publicity, the news that the IRS is still targeting conservative groups at the IRS?
Well, it's on the front pages of the Washington Times, but other than that, it may be hard to
I
find.
thought you'd like that.
So, we just have heard and just reported a week or so ago that several groups have gotten notice that they're going through another review process, which means they won't have their tax exemption. These Tea Party groups and conservative groups won't likely have their tax exemption for the 2014 election as well, and probably 2016. So the scandal sort of drags on through omission, which is we're not dealing with it, and we may have kicked a few people aside and given them nice pensions, but there's no progress on giving these guys the right under the law to practice under a tax-exempt state. And I think that that is a continuation of the scandal, and no one in Congress has really picked up on that, which I think really bothers me. Tom said something really profound before, which is Congress itself is not doing the job of oversight anymore. I grew up on the Watergate hearings and Iran-Contra and all those great hearings, where there was a lot of intensity. Congress couldn't even answer Hillary Clinton's question in the Baganza hearing. What difference would it matter? Not a single congressman could stand up and answer that question. And I think that is a contributing factor to what the problems we're seeing in Washington today. So.
John's exactly right. As a matter of fact, and again, you won't hear about it very many places, but the IRS just sent out a new round of letters within the last month and a half to Tea Party groups saying, if you'll surrender a whole bunch of your rights and pledge not to be involved in the political process, we'll give you tax-exempt status tomorrow. So the process is continuing, and we've sent a demand letter to the IRS that they stop contacting our clients, asking them to give up their rights before we get to court.
Factual question, Tom. Is it true that Judicial Watch in Florida found that Barack Obama guilty of voting fraud?
No.
No, okay. Actually, we didn't talk about this, Joe, but a question on what can we do about an education system, apparently from a young person, that's not preparing us for the workforce. I know you know a lot about education, so.
Well, it's a scandal. I mean, what's going on in the schools today, I don't think anybody in this room would disagree, is a pure scandal, where the schools have gone into propaganda and indoctrination instead of teaching underlying skills. It's why so many of you are homeschooling. I mean, I congratulate every parent who is homeschooling, because that's not easy. Just quickly on the global warming issue, we're seeing under the Common Core mandates, or the new curriculum that they're trying to do top down, there was some email exchanges and conference calls going where the environmentalists were congratulating themselves for getting everything they wanted into the Common Core curriculum. So global warming from kindergarten all the way through high school is now going to be part of this national curriculum that they're trying to impose on us. So the solution is, I think, homeschooling. It's parents getting more involved in the education of their kids, even if they're attending public schools. Don't assume that if you send your kid to a private school that it's any better. A lot of private schools are worse than public schools when it comes to political correctness and environmentalism. So you got to take charge of the education of your kids. New technology makes this a lot easier. You can now buy the curriculum. You can do online learning. You can have the best teachers in the world doing video presentations for your kids. I would urge you all to take advantage of that.
All right, we're going to, those are the questions we got, and I have 15 questions here that are all the same, basically, and I'm going to start with Myron and move down, and we're all going to try to take a shot at this. All right, the frustration out there is how the heck is this happening? And what the heck can we do about it? I mean, they're breaking the law. Should we start an impeachment movement? One person asked, frustrating, how can you send the Attorney General to jail? Who's going to indict him? Right? So you understand the basic thrust of this. And I mean, all of us feel that way. So why don't we start with you, Myron, and just go down, and when it gets to me, we'll end this.
Well, people say to me, how are things going in Washington, or think you must be, doing some great stuff now. I say, yeah, I spend all my time beating my head against the wall. it's very frustrating, and I see why you got so many questions on that. We are confronted not only with a hard left regime that is pursuing its goals through legal channels and through Congress, but is also, as we've talked about, through just ignoring the law, evading the law, making up the law. And as I said, this is a very serious threat to our institutions of liberty and prosperity, I would add. So I think, yes, I'm going to get to my point. We have to understand, first of all, that Barack Obama and his closest allies have kind of the worst thing about the left, the hard left, which is that they believe that the end justifies the means. And so we are going to have to be very vigilant. We are going to have to take advantage of any weakness or decline in the president's popularity. We're going to have to use legal channels. We're going to have to count on the House of Representatives, and we're going to have to make sure that there's a better Senate in 2015 than there is today.
You have to remember about this administration just what he said. They're true believers. You know, I was at Harvard Law School with Barack Obama. A lot of his advisors were there as our teachers, our fellow students. They believe in this. And their view is you change government as a whole and you change it quickly. You know, any one of these scandals would have been the sort of thing that got previous presidents at least seriously investigated. You would have had special counsels appointed. Everyone asks why Eric Holder is still the Attorney General. It's very simple. Under the current state of the law, you can't appoint a special prosecutor without the Attorney General asking for one. Now, what do you think the chances are Eric Holder ever will, even if the law is violated? This group is pressing on multiple fronts. They're very sophisticated in what they do. And if we want to undo the damage that they're doing, we've got to get people in office who aren't just conservative, but are skilled and knowledgeable about government so we can fix these problems.
I can speak to first the role of my profession, then obviously your role. The role of my profession is to keep exposing and keep these issues on the front burner so that policymakers and voters can make better and informed judgments. I wrote 9 stories on Benghazi before the rest of the media paid attention. I wrote the first 40 hours after it occurred, and then Susan Rice went out there and everybody covered Susan Rice's version of the story rather than the facts that I had. But by keeping at it, we were able to get the truth out there, and eventually the policymakers paid attention. In the absence of a hungry media elsewhere, the Times is going to try to do that role, and I think other media are trying to fill that space. And then the Founding Fathers gave you the ultimate solution here. They gave you the ballot box, and I think if you have a member of Congress that you don't think has done his or her oversight job well, or a president that you don't think is competent, God gave you that ballot box, and the Founding Fathers gave you a good and powerful tool to fix things. And I think these next 2 elections will help you correct a lot of things if people go out and vote.
The first thing is support Judicial Watch, of course. The second thing, we have to understand, and I think we do collectively, that Washington's a racket, and we have to operate accordingly. So we need people in Washington who can use the tools available under our system of laws to make sure the rule of law is followed. And politicians, when they run for office, talk about combating corruption. The other side's corrupt when they're running for office, and once they're there, they don't care about it. And if you think corruption is an important issue, you need to let your elected representatives know that and support the truth tellers like the groups on this panel to get at the heart of this issue. Because when you have a politician come in and waste your time talking to you about a tax modification or a policy proposal, when in fact it's all a racket, he's wasting your time. And unless we fix structurally the corruption in Washington, these public policy debates are for naught.
All right. In 30 seconds or less, I think don't raise the debt ceiling, defund Obamacare, and rein in the EPA is what Congress needs to do.
Amen.
What each of us needs to do is make this a litmus test for candidates in Republican primaries. If your candidate isn't willing to come out and say global warming is crap and I'm not going to support anything in the name of global warming, then tell them you're not going to get my vote in the Republican primary. I'll vote for somebody who's willing to take a tougher case on it. And if you want more information about climate change, go to climatechangereconsidered.org. ClimateChangeReconsidered.org. That's a great website. That's where our new report is. Don.
All right. You know, the frustration in these questions is all about how do we solve this through law. This is not solvable through law. All right? Several mentioned what the Constitution gives us is the power to change this through election. This coming election, I think, is so critical, especially picking up in the Senate. Any place that has a Senate race, you have got to do that. The second thing we have to do is we have to get our act together. The panel before on libertarianism and traditionalism, we've got to get together. Tom mentioned his, I'll mention mine. I'm not too proud to push my buck. I'm going to go out and sign them out there. We have to get our act together. Then we'll go get them. Let's get them.
All right.